I'm very excited to have our next two guests together on the couch with me right now. Michael Pollan is the author of numerous best-selling books, including The Omnivore's Dilemma, and a longtime contributor to the New York Times Magazine. His latest book is called How to Change Your Mind: What the New Science of Psychedelics Teaches Us About Consciousness, Dying, Addiction, Depression, and Transcendence. Also joining Michael and me is Tim Ferriss. Tim is the host of the Tim Ferriss Podcast, the best-selling author of the 4-Hour Work Week and the 4-Hour Body, and I can imagine after this conversation, a new book will probably be in the works called The 4-Hour Trip. Fellas, thank you so much for being here.
Good to be here, Dick.
Absolutely. We'll start off with just the question. I took my psychedelics about 35 minutes ago. When did they kick in? And is that when you did yours?
It should be any minute. Yeah.
We may be figments of your imagination.
Yeah.
Michael, what are psychedelic drugs, and what are some of the big picture things that you learned researching them regarding mental health?
Well, psychedelics is a name coined in the late 50s for what was then a new class of drugs, including LSD, psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, DMT. And these are drugs that act on the serotonin 2A receptors, which are very important in the cortex. They're highly represented in the cortex. And they induce an experience that characterized by things like depersonalization, the loss of a sense of self at high doses, synesthesia, the ability to see sounds or smell them, and a very dramatically altered state of consciousness. In recent years, there has been a renaissance of research into these compounds. There had been a very active period of research in the 50s and into the 60s, but when psychedelics were embraced by the counterculture, there ensued this backlash against them and this moral panic, and that stopped research. And the research has resumed, especially into their possible use as a therapeutic tool. In the 50s, it was discovered that these drugs were useful when they were administered in a very supportive therapeutic environment in helping people deal with the anxiety of cancer diagnosis, depression, obsession, addiction. It was used widely for alcoholism. So basically, in this renaissance, we're revisiting that research, bringing it up to modern standards, and going through this approval process to see if indeed the data supports adding these compounds to the pharmacopoeia.
Tim, you've invested in psilocybin research at Johns Hopkins.
I have. I've supported research at Hopkins, UCSF, and a handful of other places as well.
What are some of the practical, beneficial applications of psychedelic drugs that you've seen?
Varies tremendously by compound. So one aspect of the research that I think is proving to be increasingly interesting is how specific compounds, at least as far as we understand them to this point, can be very well applied to specific conditions. So MDMA, for instance, although we could discuss exactly how that contrasts with something like psilocybin, but MDMA, known more commonly as ecstasy, has tremendous efficacy with PTSD. And in some of the subject populations, or the trials I should say, you find more than 60% or even more than 80% after 2 sessions with psychotherapy no longer qualify as someone diagnosed with PTSD, according to something called the CAPS-5 score, or the CAPS-5 assessment, I should say. Then you have other what you might consider, or are widely considered, intractable or treatment-resistant conditions, like TRD, treatment-resistant depression, chronic anxiety, OCD, anorexia nervosa, which is the psychiatric disorder with the highest mortality rate of all, little known fact. And you can go down the list, and what's remarkable also about this is that, and this is something Michael and I have spoken about, and certainly something you write about in How to Change Your Mind, is that these conditions seem very discrete. They seem very siloed, but in fact, when you talk to someone like Tom Insel, who is the former head of the National Institute of or on Mental Health,
I don't know.
It's one of those.
National
Okay.
Institute on Mental Health.
There we go. NIMH. They're separate for, say, insurance reimbursement purposes, but they may in fact be related to a handful of common structures and patterns of activity in the brain. So these obsessive thought patterns, behavioral patterns may in fact, whether it's OCD, anorexia, or a whole spectrum of things in between, be effectively sort of rebooted with certain psychedelics, and psilocybin is certainly one of those.
Wow, okay. Michael, you're an immersive journalist. How can a high-dose psychedelic drug experience change someone's life?
Well, as part of my research for the book, I interviewed many people who'd had these high-dose experiences in the trials at Hopkins and NYU and other places, but finally felt like to really understand it and write about it with any kind of clarity or vividness, I would have to have this experience myself. So although I couldn't participate as a volunteer in the above-ground trials, I didn't qualify for any of the indications they were working on, and they probably didn't want a journalist to try it anyway. I found my way into what's called the psychedelic underground. There's an underground network of guides all across this country. I don't know how big it is, but it's a couple hundred people, many of whom are trained therapists. Some are doctors, psychiatrists, who are administering these drugs illegally because they believe so strongly in their efficacy and that this helps their patients. So I found my way to several different guides that I work with to see what the experience was like. And I can see I was not trying to fix a problem. I was trying to learn. I was trying to satisfy my curiosity. So I didn't go into it saying I have this addiction I want to take care of, or I'm depressed. But nevertheless, I could easily see why it was transformative for so many people. That the psychedelic experience essentially, it does a couple things, but one of the things it does is afford a perspective on the site of your own life that you haven't had before. You acquire a kind of distance, and the addicts in particular would talk about this, that they saw the destructiveness of their behavior in a way they hadn't seen it before. The other thing that seems to happen, especially when you've had an experience of what's sometimes called ego dissolution, or a mystical type experience, that it's very connecting. What happens to a lot of people who are depressed or addicted is that they lose their connection to other people, to nature, even to their earlier selves, and that the connection to the substance that they're abusing becomes stronger than anything else. I mean, alcoholics get to a point where the bottle, the access to that bottle matters more than their children, and they will jeopardize their families to continue drinking. And so that's a problem of disconnection, or connection to something like an addictive substance. And I had this experience, and it chimed with what many of the volunteers said, of feeling, as my ego went away, more connected than I ever had before, to nature, to loved ones, so I think, and this happens in depression too, there's a real disconnection from the people around you. You're so internally focused. So I think that reconnection is an important part of it, and that's been supported by some of the psychologists who've done these qualitative analyses of the experience people are having. So a new perspective can change your life. I mean, we talked yesterday about the idea of a kind of reverse trauma, in the same way that one traumatic event can reset your psychology, potentially for the rest of your life in a destructive way. There are some other kinds of events that can send you on a very healing course.
Describing this as a traumatic experience taken high dose.
Yeah, I mean, a positive traumatic experience.
Yes, of course.
One of the researchers has called it a quantum experience, in that it's just such breaking of patterns. The other thing the other metaphor, and we're using metaphors to describe this because it's very hard to get your handle on, is the idea that psychedelics reboot the brain, and that in the kinds of disorders you're talking about, that all may be symptoms of an underlying formation of just mental rigidity, people stuck in certain grooves of thought that they can't get out of. I mean, the loops of recrimination that depressed people play, that I'm not worthy of love, I'm worthless, or the addict who I can't get through life without a drink. It seems to break those patterns temporarily and shake things up in a way. In some ways, it might even be a little like electroshock therapy, ECT, in that it is temporarily disrupting patterns that are really destructive. And you have the opportunity, at least, the brain is plastic again, and the same connections may not form in the same way. So that opens up an opportunity for change.
So that was high dose. I'm actually really curious, Tim, to ask you about microdosing, which is something that you do. What is it, and what have been some of the benefits for you and for others?
Well, microdosing is very poorly understood, in part because it's all anecdotal in terms of reports. The person who actually knows the most or has collected the most data on this from people who are using it on the underground or more widely is Jim Fadiman, who coined the term microdosing. And there are people who believe, based on their own personal experiences, that sub-threshold, meaning non-psychedelic doses of, say, psilocybe mushrooms, which contain psilocybin, or very low doses of LSD, like 10 micrograms, 15 micrograms, at which doses you are not going to feel like you are tripping. You might feel like you've had a strong cup of coffee or a small amount, an Adderall, something like that, with some of the more stimulatory effects. But there are people who very firmly believe that, say, low-dose psilocybin has relieved chronic depression. And then we could move up the stack in dosing and how people use psychedelics for different purposes. So Fadiman, for instance, has supervised a number of studies, this is quite a few decades ago, looking at creative problem solving. People coming in with hard scientific problems they have not managed to figure out, like electrical engineering, for instance, and giving them slightly higher but still not full-blown psychedelic doses of LSD to see if that facilitates seeing their problem from novel perspectives, much like you would see your own problems or your own thinking from an observer perspective that is different than normal. So microdosing is certainly gaining in popularity as a topic, and I'm optimistic that a number of studies will be underway in the next 12 months or so at a few different universities looking at microdosing under a scientific lens. So I'm excited to see.
That'll be really interesting to demystify, because it is popular amongst younger people in the tech community.
Yeah.
But to know more about it from authorities who are scientists will be useful, I think.
Yeah, and also to see at that low dose, certainly if we're talking about transcendental or ego-dissolving doses of these compounds, it's pretty clear if you've taken a placebo or not. But at the lower doses, if you tell someone you're giving them 10 micrograms, does it give them 20% greater executive function because they believe it will? Maybe. So I actually think there's a great role to play for placebo control in looking at the effects of microdosing.
In one way, it's easier to study. You're right, for that reason, that you really can do a control and a placebo. In another way, it's hard, though, to organize a study where you're essentially giving people LSD and you're letting them get in their car and drive away, which is terrifying to with good reason, to IRBs and people like that. But the placebo effect within around psychedelics is particularly powerful. Matt Johnson, who's one of the researchers, described them to me as placebos on rocket boosters. The expectation, even when you're getting the drug and it's a high dose, the expectation of what will happen strongly biases what will happen. And that among therapists who use it, if you're a Freudian, your patients will have Freudian imagery in their hallucinations. If you're a Jungian, they'll have Jungian imagery. So even if microdosing is merely a placebo effect, I think the conviction that it works and the social conviction that it works may make it work. So these studies, if they don't turn out well, could ruin a perfectly good treatment.
Well, this is, I mean, not to mention psychedelics are very tricky to study for a lot of reasons. And you also get the nocebo effect. Right? So if you have researchers who firmly believe that psychedelics have no value, but are doing the administration and supervising the sessions, you see in many cases very different outcomes, which is very frustrating, I think, in some ways, to structure studies well, to look at these compounds because they behave so differently or they provoke effects that are so different and by mechanisms so different from other classes of drugs.
This is a good segue, though, I think, actually.
Okay.
This is wonderful. I just know that there's a few other questions I want to get to, but I love this. I can nerd out with you about this. I was actually curious to know, because I know you both are very interested in mental health, and there's a mental health crisis in this country, as I know you believe. I was curious to know how might psychedelic drugs be used to effectively treat mentally ill patients? And can you offer some examples for the types of illnesses that researchers believe these drugs might actually affect?
So there is a mental health crisis. It's not an opinion. I mean, the statistics suggest that rates of depression are rising worldwide. Depression is now the leading cause of disability worldwide, according to the WHO. Suicide rates in the United States are up dramatically in the last few years. Addiction, we know, 70,000 people were killed by opiates last year. It's an astonishing number.
Yeah.
So we do have a problem, and the tools that we have are not very good. I mean, essentially, the SSRIs are the last important innovation in mental health care, and that goes back 40 years. And people are very dissatisfied with them, both therapists and patients. So there is a desperate need for new tools, and that explains, I think, some of the openness of more than I expected to find of the mental health establishment to looking at these drugs. They're not going to be for all different kinds. They're not a panacea. There are, Tim was describing a set of illnesses at one end of the spectrum, addiction, depression, anxiety, obsession. These are all characterized by a kind of rigidity of thought, brains that are stuck in patterns. Mental behavior that's on a loop and not progressing. At the other end of the spectrum are a number of disorders characterized by brains that are unstuck, too unstuck, schizophrenia, personality disorders, manic depression, and it's not generally believed that these will be useful in that case. Basically, psychedelics increase the entropy in the brain, the disorder as the experience strongly suggests, but that it unblocks this kind of stuckness, and so it's going to be at that end of the spectrum, I think, that they will be most useful.
Mm-hmm. You once said that everything you learned about food and health could be summed up in 7 words.
Yeah.
Eat food, not too much, mostly plants.
Right.
What would be, from the two of you, one sentence that would sum up a psychedelic drug use, your advice?
So somebody provided this for me not long ago. It was something like, take psychedelics, not too often, mostly mushrooms.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, that's not bad. But I don't like to be prescriptive about psychedelics.
Okay.
I'm more comfortable being prescriptive about food. Tim, what do you got?
What do I have? Oh boy. I would say be optimistic, wear your seatbelt, pump the brakes. I think that we're in a potentially beautiful position right now, societally, culturally, scientifically, to do a lot of good with these compounds and to resurrect them to their rightful place in the sort of pantheon of pharmaceuticals that can be used to alleviate suffering. There are a lot of ways to screw that up, and we've seen many examples of how that can be screwed up with irrational exuberance and haphazard use, amateurs masquerading as professionals, people going off 1 or 2 posts on the internet and then becoming shamans. These are all things that can create very large problems. And it really only takes, say, the child of one lawmaker or a catchy phrase that associates any number of these very, very valuable compounds with something awful to upset the apple cart. And I think that inevitably people are going to get it wrong. And with large numbers, you're going to have the proselytizers who are actually doing the most damage by getting the message wrong and making mistakes. But I would encourage people who get very excited about these compounds to exercise caution. They've been around for hundreds of years in most cases, or thousands of years, or I should say used for hundreds of thousands of years. They are, for all intents and purposes, not going away. You don't need to try every acronym that represents a psychedelic in the next 3 months. You do not need to do that. There's no need. And in fact, there are a lot of reasons not to do that. So I would say be optimistic, support the science, and pump the brakes. Yeah.
Fellow psychonauts, we're unfortunately out of time, but I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being here. I'd like to thank Michael Pollan and Tim Ferriss for sitting down on the couch with me, talking about psychedelics and demystifying it, explaining the positive, useful attributes to them moving forward. There's a lot of hope, and I'm very excited about this. And for those of you out there watching, please continue to tune into our website at southbysouthwest.com/live for more live interviews in the coming days.